All right, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Great to have you all today. Super excited to be here with Jaime Schmidt, somebody who I massively admire for her bootstrapping skills, but also ability to build a business and exit it, and then also exit a second business. You do so much for the entrepreneurial community, and I know people that have worked with Jaime and just talked about how extraordinarily graceful, but also smart she is and how hardworking she is. So somebody I really admire. So thank you for being here. Without further ado, I'm going to quickly talk about FFC and the 10th house, which is our private membership community. We are currently doing a cohort and recruitment for that. It ends January 30th. And that is for a consumer packaged goods cohort. So super relevant to the conversation today. And again, that's our private membership community. You'll get access to in-person events at least once per month in New York and LA, as well as an ongoing 24/7 digital community to ask all of your burning questions to, smaller groups that you'll get connected to, people that are going through similar things. So definitely check that out. That's the 10th house and apply by January 30th. But I'm going to dive in with Jaime because we have so many questions. People submitted questions ahead of time as well. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to walk through her amazing bio, and that's that she is the founder of Schmidts Naturals and is known for modernizing natural personal care products and bringing them to the mainstream market. And under her leadership, she grew into a household name and after 7 years was acquired by CPG giant Unilever. She's also the author of Supermaker, Crafting Business on Your Own Terms, a personalized guide on how to put your business on the map, turning your passion into profit. She's an investor and co-owner of Color Capital, a fund that invests in consumer products and emerging technologies. And most recently, she co-founded BFF, a brand and community that provides access and education in Web3 for underrepresented groups, which has been acquired by Boss Beauties, a media and entertainment brand that inspires the next generation of women and girls. So perfect home for that. And super also impressive that you've been able to play in so many different categories as well.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah. I'm going to dive into the first question because I think it's such an important one that a lot of times I think business owners don't ask themselves, and that you've sort of famously talked about as being such an important first step, and that's setting an intention for your business and then also examining that intention.
Mhm.
Can you speak to what you mean by this?
Yeah. I don't mean have everything figured out before you jump in, because I think that wasn't the case for me, and I think that's kind of impossible, especially as first-time entrepreneurs. But what I mean by setting your intention is really understanding what your goal is for the business, right? Like, what kind
Yeah.
of customers are you after? Who is your target demographic, and will that change over time? But I think the key point here too is that that's probably going to change.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to check in with that, intention as the business continues to grow. There were phases of my business where I thought I had it all, figured out in terms of, the long-term plan, the marketing strategy, and sort of, I guess, who our target demographic truly was. And there were so many times that I personally and our team were just surprised, to find out we had customers that we were completely overlooking, right? And just, product lines that we hadn't been considering.
Yeah, I think you don't necessarily, you might, from a long-term perspective, want to sell the business, or maybe you want to keep it as a lifestyle business, or
Mhm.
maybe you don't want to be a product business ultimately, and you realize you want to go more into services. So I think all of those things are also really good to weigh, so that
Mhm.
you're sprinting in the right direction.
Yeah.
Um, in a recent conversation with someone else who had bootstrapped their business, you actually talked about the importance of putting blinders on as you're building. Can you speak to why you feel like that's essential?
Yeah. So important and so difficult. It's
So hard.
human nature to compare ourselves, whether not just in business, but, everyday life. Especially as an entrepreneur, you're constantly looking at the competition,
Yeah.
analyzing, how their success is versus, how far along you are. And I'm totally victim of that. I wrote in my book that I used to do what I called late night creeping online, looking at, what my competitors were up to, what they were posting on Facebook, and just like totally driving myself crazy. And then I realized one day, like, it wasn't healthy. It was not the best use of my time. And then my time was much better spent just focusing on, what I wanted, for myself and for the business. That doesn't mean totally like, turning a blind eye to, what's happening. You have to understand your industry, of course. But really, focusing on your goals, not comparing. Every situation is so different, especially as a bootstrapped entrepreneur, because you find yourself comparing, your brand and your progress to those that have been fundraising, people working with a ton of capital. And so it's just not healthy. So I think it's just finding, that balance of like understanding what's happening, but also keeping, the vision on like what you are doing.
And I even find that I totally agree with that. I think sometimes you can end up sort of accidentally copycatting.
Yeah, without realizing, maybe because you're inspired by something, or in your head, like, that's the right way to do it.
So if you're not sitting there staring at what other people are doing, and you're also, I had actually said this to somebody in another startup I worked at. I was like, if we're too busy looking at the competition, then we're going to start copying them instead of being focused on the customer, right? Like,
especially when you're like,
how do I innovate that?
100%, and especially in your like advertising, because there's certain, categories of products where everybody sort of uses the same messaging. It's recycled over and over.
Yeah.
But then if you, just start thinking like just organically, like, what would I say about this product, or what are my specific customers telling me? Like, then, your messaging is like sincere to the brand that you are building.
Yeah. And everything the consumers told you.
Right.
And as you think about bootstrapping, Jaime, like, how and when did you pay yourself?
Yeah, well, I have to admit it was a little messy in the beginning. My personal expenses and my business expenses were a little bit tangled up. Not good advice. They're not good. So I think, that's the first thing I would tell you is like definitely keep them separate. And I didn't pay myself for the first couple of years because I couldn't. The money that I was making was directly being recycled back into the business, but I did have a couple of side projects that were keeping me, I guess, going. Very, very part-time positions that were like just enough, to give me what I needed. I was, and still am, married at the time. So I had, my husband's income, but it was very humble, right? I was a new mom. So it was a family of 3 of us working off like a $35,000 salary. So we were definitely like sacrificing every day. We weren't going out to fancy dinners. We weren't, doing much besides like working and just believing in the business and hoping that one day it would pay off. But I do encourage people, to really make space in your budget for a salary. I don't recommend like thinking, that you don't deserve it or that that's not necessary, because you need it to survive and you need it to stay motivated. And so I think, looking back, I probably would have taken probably a little bit bigger cut a little bit earlier on if I could.
And when you're thinking about the sort of time horizon where you are looking for an exit, say you're taking a very low salary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not a salary that one can typically thrive off of. In other words, like, did you think about, okay, I want to exit by this time frame, or my numbers suggest that I need to in order to make this financially viable for me?
I had 0 plans of getting acquired. And honestly, like, I wasn't looking very far ahead. So if you'd asked me about the future, like, I had no clue what that looked like for me. I knew that I was happy with what I was doing, and I knew that I was, making customers happy, and I knew that I was onto something, and that, I was getting really positive feedback. And so I just had to like keep believing in it, and live day to day. And I think like as an entrepreneur, especially a bootstrapped entrepreneur, you can't look too far ahead. You just can't. And so, once the company had grown to a certain point, like, of course I was a little more, mature in my thinking around the potential of the business and what, an exit could look like. But honestly, like, that's not what drove me every day. And it's not something that I like really let myself think about too much.
And did you have, like, what did your financial structure look like? And how did you sort of handle your finances out of the gate as a bootstrapped business, right? Like, were you constantly, from a financial hygiene perspective, were you constantly monitoring your numbers? And did you have that background, or did you have someone else who was really your partner in doing that?
Yeah, it was messy. As I said, like, even some of my personal expenses were mixed up, but I had I had a general understanding of like what I needed each month for the business, but every
Yeah.
month did look different. So, for example, I had a very early feature on TV, and that resulted in a lot of orders. So that was a great month, right? Because we could recycle
Yeah.
that money back into the business. And but some months, we're a lot more tight, and so it was just a matter of like understanding what the priority expenses were and making sure that I was, investing and putting money into things that truly were seeing results. So like paid
Yeah.
ads that I knew were delivering customers. So like paying attention to that data. Um, and it's just again like sacrifice and just giving up things that like you otherwise maybe not getting the coffee that morning that you that you'd been accustomed to getting. But I also was exploring things like lines of credit. I did take out a couple lines of credit. That still takes work. It's a distraction from building the business, but it's easier than raising capital. And of course, you're not giving up equity that way. And there's things like grants and loans. I never took out any of those, but there's so many resources today that, I think entrepreneurs, especially women, grants targeted towards women, which is awesome. So certainly look into those options too.
Well, out of curiosity, because you said that you never took out a grant or a loan.
I took out lines of credit, so loan, technically.
Okay.
Loan, yeah.
So with that, is that how you funded your inventory initially?
No, I grew so slowly in those first few years that I didn't need a big capital infusion. And that's when I look back on the way my business grew, that was the secret. It was just growing slow. And when I started the business, I didn't set out to build something huge. Many of you probably know I started at the farmers markets. It was more of a hobby. I wasn't out to build this big brand and sell at all these retailers and get acquired. It was more like, this is fun. Customers are liking my product. And so it was slow. And I had nobody to answer to because I was by myself, and I didn't even hire anybody for the first couple of years.
Wow.
So that afforded me
Literally just you.
Yeah, just me. And my husband was there like to help if I wanted to take a picture or something. He helped build up my website. And eventually he came on full time, and he was amazing. But it was me, just building at the pace that worked for me. And I would never change that about my story, right? Is because I think that was my competitive advantage. Is I didn't have anybody to answer to. I didn't have deadlines, or goals that I had to achieve. It was more like, this is cool. I'm going to keep going and see where this takes me. But that was just for the first few years. And so, but I think that helped me with, for example, I had in-house manufacturing, right? I never outsourced my production, which is a huge expense, too. But I was able to start very small on my stovetop. So like I might have like a tiny little pot. And then as the business got bigger and I had a little more revenue, I could upgrade to a bigger pot. And so just, very small intentional steps, that just made sense based on the capital that I had at the time.
Yeah. I love that. And it's actually surprising to learn, right? That's how you did it. But if you do go slowly, then you're not, out of so much cash, and ultimately having to stretch yourself in ways that just really aren't possible. When just sort of going back to those beginning stages again, when you were toggling between side hustles and this, like, was there a point where from a revenue perspective, you're like, okay, this is enough where I know this is a real business. I'm now gonna stop with the side hustles?
Yeah, that was probably about 3 or 4 years in, and at that time, I did bring my husband on full time. So that was a big move for us as a family because he gave up, the income that we had, and so it was like, all right, we're all in, like, let's do it. And that was when I just started to hire a team and started to really think about how my product could compete outside the natural niche. So, selling a natural deodorant, there's a certain subset of customers who are like totally like advocates for that type of product. But then I recognize, how do I expand beyond like that natural consumer and really reach just people who want to use deodorant in general, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of gets into the marketing side of the business, but how can I sell this product to people that aren't looking for a healthy natural deodorant? They just want a really good deodorant that works. And so it was that sort of turning point where I started to like see the potential beyond like that niche. But I do think it's really important to start niche, to start with like, a customer.
Super users and super customers.
Yeah.
And how did you decide, Jaime, for you, like where you were going to focus your time versus where you were going to bring other people in? You've been doing all of it for so long.
That's a good question. a lot of it was like, what do I not like doing? Like what's just
Yeah.
irritating and annoying, and hiring people that are good,
Yeah.
at handling those things, but then also obviously like admitting, my weaknesses and where I'm, just not strong, and so. But again, it's really tricky when you're bootstrapped because every single hire really counts and every single position has to deliver results. You don't have the luxury of extra employees, hanging around and, working, just a few hours. It's like everybody's schedule is full and they're delivering. And so I think I see myself more as a generalist. I don't think there was one area that I was like really, really strong in or any area I was really weak in. It was more operationally, like just keeping things going and staying organized. I really think like organization is such a big part of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah. And just keeping with it, right?
Yeah.
And when did you decide to untangle your personal finances from your business
I
finances?
mean, I knew in the beginning it wasn't good. And so I think, within probably a year or two, like I was like, all right, let's hire an accountant and have them help me like figure this out.
Yeah.
And it's so important now looking back, like when the company did get acquired, those are the things that slow things down and get a little messy, is like trying to make sense of those financial reports. So, the sooner you can do it, the better. But it's hard when a business starts as a hobby, and it's just something that you don't really see it, turning into its own entity, separate from you. And so, it's challenging.
Yeah. To figure out how do you pull them
Yeah.
apart. And then you're like, oh, wow, this is a real business.
Yeah.
And there are probably great tax implications that I can use for personal finances.
Right.
When did you decide that you wanted to sell the business, or was it something where Unilever reached out proactively?
Yeah. So throughout the growth of the business, I had occasional investors or acquirers reach out and, nothing major. And I just kind of ignored it. I wasn't interested. But we got to a point, it was probably about like year 6, and had started to sell in mass retail. So Target, Costco, Walmart all came like at once. And so all my capital was tied up.
And they came to you.
Right. I had brokers and things, so it was a combination of a lot of the retailer interest was incoming, but a lot of it was outbound, so it was a mix. But having all my capital tied up on store shelves meant like I didn't have a lot to work with, and I was starting to realize like, okay, something's got to give here. I don't want to take out another loan of credit. I need C-level people, right? I hadn't really hired a C-suite, and I recognized if I really want to compete with the top players, like I probably should open my eyes to other opportunities, and so. Had some incoming interest actually from one potential acquirer, and then brought on Goldman Sachs to broker the deal. So if you have a broker like Goldman, they're fantastic for having those conversations with the potential acquirers. So you don't have to deal with them one-on-one. They're basically the middleman. They go back and forth between you and them, and we'll sort of manage that whole process. And so once Unilever expressed their interest, then some of Unilever's competitors were like, "Ooh, I want, maybe I want a piece of this." And so that's when like other people started coming to the picture, and then we were entertaining a few different conversations.
And this is at this point you were. Do you think that the sort of real inflection point was the getting into these really big retailers, or was it more the fact that you had reached a certain revenue threshold?
I think a little bit of both. I did find out from Unilever after we were acquired that they had been watching the brand for like 4 years. So that was really cool. I always tell entrepreneurs, like, you never know who's watching, right? Like you're under the radar, but really like if you're doing something right, like, people will notice. And so they were just seeing that we were taking their sales, right? Because we were competing with like, Dove and Secret and those brands that like, they're like, why are our revenues going down? Because it's, who's the Schmidts brand? And so, they have a choice. They can either try to create a similar product or brand under their portfolio, or they can acquire, which is generally, probably a lot easier for them. And they were attracted to the founding story. They also really liked some of our marketing techniques that they weren't using. And yeah.
And as far as your finances go, we actually had a conversation sort of similar to this, where we had talked about audited financials from somebody, because they were saying sometimes you have to have audited financials. You had an accountant on board at this point. Did you have your husband was on as the CFO?
No, he helped with marketing. So marketing and communications. Yeah.
So did you have a CFO in-house at this
I
point?
never did. That was something that I had outsourced, which I think is smart. A lot of founders will assume they have to hire all these positions in-house,
Yeah.
but it's often a lot cheaper and less risky to just outsource.
Yeah.
And then, you're paying somebody part-time versus like having, another employee on staff.
Yeah. Wow. That's impressive then that you had an outsourced CFO as you went through a sales process. And
Yeah, that is, yeah. Because you need a lot from them too, right? When it gets
yeah.
to that point, there's like so much auditing and things that need to happen. So like that relationship needs to be strong. So,
And did you have just, I know I'm getting very specific around
yeah.
fees, but I think it's super helpful information as founders are sort of thinking about what that process looks like. Did you have to pay that person a lot more than like a retainer, or was that part of?
Yeah. So generally, so it would be like a monthly retainer that we would pay them. And then for
Yeah,
something, above and beyond, like negotiating acquisition, yeah, there'd be like a separate contract that,
got it.
yeah. And you want to take care of them because they're the ones like doing the heavy
Yeah,
lifting, right? And on a very tight timeline. So there'd be times when, Unilever would ask us for a report and they needed it the next day. And, the CFO, probably has other things going on. And so, we had to depend on them to like really turn things around quickly. So it's stressful and challenging, but it worked out for us. Yeah.
but I think having a good team is so essential.
Yeah.
Is there anything that really surprised you about that process?
I think it's like just how vulnerable and open you have to be. There's so much that they need. A lot of you have probably heard of a data room, and if not, it's basically a place where all the information that the acquirer is requesting is stored. So it's like a file or folder, basically with like all these different like spreadsheets and reports and data and things. And you open that up for them to take a look at. And so you're basically exposing everything about your business. And of course, you're
The things
signing.
you probably didn't even know.
Yeah, and it's like scary. You're like, I'm telling them everything. You're like, if this doesn't go through, well, now they know all of it, right? And we also had like on-site visits where they were touring the factory and like taking notes and looking at everything. And I'm like, I felt like I was just like, everything was being exposed and it's scary.
Yeah.
But it's part of the process and what you have to go through to make it happen.
Did
There's
you,
of course there's NDAs and things, but like,
I was gonna say, did you have like an attorney that like created these protectionary terms?
yeah. And NDAs like prevent obviously the people from talking about it or just stealing your ideas and things. But like, once people see things, it's like
Can't
no
unsee
longer
it.
proprietary, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then in terms of now sitting on the other side of the table, right? You're an investor, you've had a successful company. Are there any patterns or trends that you look for that you
Mm.
feel really predict a company's success?
It's so hard. Well, first off, so since I didn't raise capital, I feel like I have a different POV as an investor. And so,
Yeah.
one thing I do appreciate is when a founder has bootstrapped for several years because they have like a real understanding of like what it means to build in a sustainable and responsible way. But beyond that, like it's tough to predict. There are some investments I've made that I was like totally convinced. I'm like, oh, this is the one. Like, and then the company shuts down for whatever reason. And then there's been others that were like a little riskier, where you kind of just took the leap. And then those are the ones that are like they're performing and they're on track for something big.
Yeah.
And so there's I don't think there's any clear answer to that. But the obvious things to look for is like the founder passion. You can really tell, when talking to somebody, like how much they believe in the business. I don't obsess over credentials. I don't care a whole lot about, a founder's background. I think it's interesting and important in some situations, but I'm the perfect example of like somebody who, started their business without any entrepreneurial experience. I hadn't worked for any startups.
Now, what was your background?
So I got a degree in business, but just
Yeah.
kind of chose it because I didn't know what else to do. And then I ended up working in human resources for several years after college. I was working my way up the corporate ladder. Didn't love it, but I was, doing well and making good salary. And then quit that, and then went on this whole like soul searching journey of trying to figure things out. So I was, responsible in my career and had, some impressive achievements, I guess, but like I wasn't like your typical whole entrepreneur. And so I don't obsess over that. And I think that's refreshing for a lot of founders, who think they have
Yeah.
to like prove something about themselves. And then, one thing I do get really excited about those brands that can start niche, like Schmidts did, really targeted consumer base, but then has the potential to go big. And the deodorant is a perfect example. Natural deodorant, you're catering to like a natural consumer, but then is there a bigger customer category, like just the general deodorant consumer? So starting small with potential to go big. And then just, innovating in a way that's like interesting. I think it's so hard because every category is so crowded. It's hard to come up with something entirely new, right? Like we've seen most things, and to create a product we've never seen before is pretty much unheard of. But there's ways to be innovative, within that category. So always looking for that.
And then you talked about the organizational piece.
Yeah.
Are there ways that you sort of vet founders to understand like what they're doing in their process to ensure organization?
Right. You can tell with email communications and phone calls and just general, sort of energy with, even on their socials, what's their cadence and things. And I think just like, relationships, like you just get a certain vibe for someone, and a lot of it is truly based on that.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as sort of going back to some of the brokers, can you talk about that process? Not the bankers, but more brokers that sort of helped you in that process of going into retailers? Because I think there's probably founders on here. Like I
Yeah.
wouldn't even know if I had a consumer company today, which I don't,
Yeah.
obviously. If I had one, I wouldn't even know like where do I go to get somebody that would help me sell into retail?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's two things that I think are important for any CPG company, consumer packaged goods company. One, as you say, is a broker, and which is basically somebody who is the middleman between you and the retailer. And sometimes retailers, especially bigger accounts, don't want to work directly with the founder. They want to work with the broker because they have a relationship with them. They can basically knock out, multiple brands in one conversation. So let's say this broker has like 10 brands that they represent. If Target wants to, reorder their products, they can be like, okay, I want, 30 units of Schmidts and 30 of this. So it's just easy and streamlined. So that, finding those brokers, a lot of it comes through the retailers, right? So if you're talking to Target, for example, and they're like, okay, we want to carry your product, but you need a broker. And you're like, well, who do you recommend? So a lot of them came that way. But then also distributors are important. And those are basically the shipping companies that are going to deliver your product to the store. So you could, of course, ship directly, but if you have a distributor, then that again is another middleman who will take out some of the extra work on the end of the retailer. And a lot of retailers will require that you have that as well. So in terms of, connecting with these groups, it's basically through your retailer, who do they recommend, or Google, of course, but that doesn't always turn up the best results. But networking, if you can go to industry trade shows, that's always super helpful. For me, it was the Natural Products Expo. We had a booth there, and even if the years that we didn't have a booth, we would just go and walk the halls, and you could just meet like so many people that way.
Yeah, I've heard amazing things about that.
Yeah.
And did you ever go directly, or did you only use a broker?
Yeah, in the beginning, I was like as direct as it gets, like literally delivering my products like by myself, like driving with my son, who was a newborn at the time, and we would just like go drop off products at the stores. So that was fun, and it was a good part of the story. But that gets old.
How many of you can relate to that, by the way?
Well, it's funny too, because like if
every entrepreneur story.
Yeah, it's just the best part of like those early stages. But even like if they ordered 6 units, so I sold to some really tiny stores, so all they would get is like 6. And I would drive like across town, like 30 minutes, like to drop off like 6, 60.
Right.
And so in the beginning, you're eager, right? Like you'll do anything. And then it starts to become a little unsustainable. And you're like, okay, I need some like boundaries around this stuff.
Yeah. Did any of the farmers market yield sort of these bigger retail opportunities?
Yeah, I actually had some retailers approach me at the markets. And that was so satisfying and so like validating of what I was doing, and some of them were tiny, they were like, hey, I own a little gift shop down the street. Would you be interested in selling? And a lot of it was consignment. A lot of you probably know that consignment is you give your product to them and you don't get paid until they sell it, which is not sustainable, especially if you're bootstrapped, but it's a way to get into the doors and to start saying, hey, I'm sold at, these stores.
Yeah. Consignment is a little painful, but it's certainly it's certainly an option. It's really good also for like marketing and positioning of where you want your brand to be.
Yeah.
What types of businesses do you invest in and why?
Yeah. So when I started my fund, it was right after the acquisition, and my goal was really to focus on early stage CPG because that's what I understood the most, and that's where I felt I could have the biggest impact. And that's still true of some brands, but I've started to look a little bit more later stage. And again, that's because I really appreciate those companies that have taken the time to bootstrap and to really get their footing before they start raising. And then I've also gotten a little bit more into tech. You talked at the beginning about my experience in the Web3 scene with BFF. So I've taken a little bit of interest in that whole space. And now I'm very obsessed with pickleball. If anybody follows me, they know. And there's a lot of investment opportunities there. I'm actually looking at an opportunity to invest in a couple leagues and a team. And so that has my interest right now. So a lot of it is just really kind of what personally has me excited.
Yeah. I love pickleball too. And I'm not very good at it, ironically, but I enjoy it. So
It's
there's
so
that.
fun. Yeah.
It's so much fun. I do want to jump into some audience questions because there's a lot of them because I think you're sharing so much relevant and specific experience, which is so helpful. Antonia asked about what marketing strategies you feel made the most impact that ultimately impressed like a Unilever.
Yeah. I think early on it was just really playing around with different messaging. So you might have an idea that you think is going to sell the best to your customers, right? If you're like, for example, the natural deodorant that actually works, and maybe a lot of people respond to that. But then getting a little more, I guess, courageous with what that messaging could be, and trying out things that you think might be a little bold, and just seeing how they react. And then of course you can track those metrics to see what is resulting in sales. We also were extremely generous with discounts and free samples and things like buy one, get one, just to get people to try it for the first time. Because I was totally convinced that if they tried the product, they would be back for more, So just really just having confidence in the product and taking some cuts early on to, assume that the repeat customers is where the real revenue is going to come in.
Yeah. Especially with a deodorant, it's something where it gets into your rotation. And
but today, I do think if you're marketing a brand today, just going crazy with on TikTok and Instagram and things, and that wasn't as relevant to me. I sold the business in 2017, and it was starting to become important, of course. But I think today, and that's hard. I know there's a lot of noise out there on socials, but I do think if there's a way to do it, that makes sense and is affordable. And then influencer partnerships too. I seeded a lot of product to a bunch of different YouTubers and other influencers of all different levels, and saw some good results that way too.
Yeah. Melissa asked about how you decided whether or not to accept an acquisition offer, and if there was actually room for negotiation.
Yeah, lots of negotiation actually. So one of the things that I learned is that you, of course, as not desperate, but as excited as you are, for this opportunity, you have to remind yourself that you have just as much power as they do to negotiate, right? You both need to be happy with this deal. So you want to make them happy, and impress them, but at the same time, they have to impress you and prove themselves to you. And if something feels off, then it's probably not the right fit. So just making it clear what your expectations are from the deal, and you can definitely surprise yourself with the things that you can negotiate.
Especially things like earn out, because if you stay there and keep running that business, you have to really think about what that means for you and your life and your ability to perform.
One thing that's funny that I didn't negotiate but didn't think about was free deodorant for life. So anytime I go to the store, and my son uses Schmidts, the whole family, I'll buy a stick, and my son's like, "Why aren't you getting this for free?" I'm like, "I'm sure if I emailed them, they would send me it, of course." But I don't know. I like to support the brand, but it is funny. He's like, "You should have free deodorant for life." You're right. I should.
You should. And that probably adds up,
Yeah.
But it's just the painfulness of being I created this. Why am I sitting here and buying this is what I schlepped all the way across town.
I could make it, I guess,
to try to sell. So yeah, you could start
making non-compete agreements. I think are important. obviously there's criteria around like they don't want you starting another deodorant brand, right? But can you get that down from 5 years to 2 or whatever? There's little places to negotiate that,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Good point. I didn't even really think about that one either. And it's if you're good at your category, you're good at your category, or maybe there's like an iteration on what you initially created that you would like to do that wouldn't necessarily compete with your old business, but maybe could be by extension.
Yes, exactly.
How long, Samantha asked how long the acquisition process lasts, like from start to finish?
Yeah, it was pretty fast. I think the whole thing was 3 or 4 months, honestly.
Wow.
Yeah, and during the holidays, I think that's part of the reason it went so quickly because we were trying to get done by the year end. So this is all happening around like Thanksgiving and Christmas, and like it was
Merry Christmas and Happy New
Year. Yeah, it was wild. But I've been in other situations. So I actually went through an acquisition from what BFF was acquired by Boss Beauties recently, and that is a different type of acquisition, which but still took way longer. So those conversations started in March, and the acquisition happened in October. So there's things that
Was there a bank involved in that one?
No, that was just between us, which probably
I think that's probably part of it, right? Is it you have people at the table that are really used to acquisitions? Like if the acquirer has made a lot of acquisitions in the past, then it's like they probably have their very standard process and sort of range of terms that they're willing to negotiate, and then they're also more incentivized to close during a certain period, like you said, year end, using that budget. So, but that's interesting. Just out of curiosity, how long was the second one?
The BFF one?
Yeah.
Yeah, the conversation started in March, and then the acquisition happened in October. So for a much smaller business, it took longer, a little bit longer too. But yeah, it depends on the industry and who's involved. And one thing with the Schmidts acquisition too is that one of our biggest competitors got acquired like the month before we did, which made things a little more stressful and interesting. So you think about like how their valuation played into our valuation, right? Like, are we getting more or getting less because of the way that their valuation played out? And it also was like, oh crap, it's like now or never kind of thing.
How much are you driving that versus the bankers?
Both. I mean, the bankers are just like, their goal is to close the thing, right? Because that's the only way they're going to see any rewards. And so they're trying to keep both sides happy, which is super stressful for them. And then, so we're trying to get as much as we can. The acquirer's trying to get as much as they can. And like, and just making sure everybody agrees on all the terms and things. It's hard. It's wild. I think, finding that broker that you can just be direct and open with, and definitely on a text basis, right? Like, and then once it comes down to like the actual signing, like that's a whole other thing. I have stories from that. It's in my book.
So we have another question, and I think it's coming up so much, Jaime, with our CPG founders, especially because I think it's a really hard market, right? For there's, like you said, there's so much out there, and it's so hard to compete from a marketing perspective because there's a lot of noise. But from a funding perspective, like given the market conditions, what advice do you have for founders deciding whether to pursue fundraising or to continue bootstrapping?
I would say definitely have a plan for both. If you think bootstrapping is the right approach, then you should simultaneously be building, investor relationships, or at least knowing, how you would fundraise and who you would go out to. So keeping the networking going is important. If you choose to fundraise and everything falls through, definitely have a plan for how you're going to bootstrap. I think it's very personal, and it depends on, how fast you want to grow, what the competition looks like. I always say that, there's two situations. If you are bootstrapped and you're thinking, maybe I should raise capital, there's two indicators, in my opinion, that tell you like, maybe you should start looking at raising. So one is if you're saying no to opportunities, right? Because you simply don't have the capital. Like if you're turning down a huge deal, you can't fill an opening order for Target because you just don't have that money and you're not able to get a line of credit or whatever. Maybe then you're okay. Maybe it makes sense to bring in money. And then the second is like, if you're in a really competitive industry and your competition is growing so much more quickly than you are, and you need to keep up, like that might be a situation too, where you're like, okay, this makes sense for me to start looking at fundraising.
That's so helpful.
Good.
Because in the first instance, it's nice because you know exactly how you're going to be using those funds. And I think that from an investor perspective is really important to understand is like, what is the potential for this investment that I'm putting in? Because at the end of the day, like if you're taking money in from investors, they want a return. And so you have to have sort of a good sense of what does that potential return look like?
Right.
Danielle asks what the best way is to prep for pitching to retailers and landing retailers.
Yeah, I would say like certainly understand the competitive landscape, like know what brands they carry that are in your category. And the trick is really talking about how your brand fits in amongst those other brands, like how it complements them, and not about how your brand is better. I learned that the hard way, well, not the hard way, but in an embarrassing way through a meeting with Target. I went in and I was telling them how, we were going to outsell Tom's of Maine for all these reasons. And they're like, okay, well, Tom's is doing great. We're selling a lot of it. So like, we're not going to get rid of them. So, how does bringing in Schmidts really help me? So then I thought, oh, I need to like, change the way I'm talking about this and talk about, why Schmidts fills a gap right in the products that they're already carrying. So less about like how you're better and more about like how you complement the whole category.
Love that. I love that you went in and you're like, we can replace Tom's.
Right. Because you think like, oh, I'm just going to talk about like why we're so good and like how we're better than the competition. But like, no, that doesn't work because they're carrying them for a reason, right? They're not going to work. Yeah.
Right. It's doing well.
Yeah.
For Mira, she asked, what is the best way to find distributors? You talked a little bit about finding brokers.
Yeah, I really think just going to trade shows for one and just really networking within your industry, posting on LinkedIn, asking, or Twitter, asking for advice. And then again, the stores, I think that's your biggest, I think generally you want the relationship with the store before you look for a distributor. I think that always helps because distributors get a lot of interest. And if you can go to them and say, hey, I'm really close to closing the deal with Whole Foods, but I need you to distribute my product, that will get their attention. So the retailers are generally, pretty willing to help you out with that.
But do you have to already have the retailer on board if you
are going to? In my experience, it's like those conversations with the retailers happened and they would say like, oh, this would be a lot easier for us if you just had a broker, or you had a distributor, that would be our preference. And so I'm like, okay, I'm ready. Like, just tell me like, who should we work with? And usually they'll have, certain ones.
We have time for just one more question. I feel like we have a lot more, but
we'll do a part two.
I know we can do a part two. There's so many questions for you because again, like bootstrapping, you just don't hear of this. And I feel like not enough stories are sort of shared on actionable ways to do it, especially for consumer brands. But I think a lot of consumer brands are being forced to bootstrap right now. So really essential. Any other sort of pieces of advice that from your journey were really integral? A lot of people ask, like, how did you go from being a farmer's market brand to like a household name? And of course, that's slow growth. But like, were there any pivotal moments that taught you something big that you're like, I tell all of these founders X?
Yeah. One thing I've thought about actually recently was like, I was thinking about just all the setbacks that I had. Like, how did I keep going? Like, how did I, push through those? And it was really just this mindset of like viewing the setback as like a checkpoint, like to make sure that you're really in it, right? Because if you're, it's just that one moment where you're like, okay, I'm being challenged here for a reason because I like this is a big deal. I'm building this business, and like it's your chance to sort of check in with yourself. Like, do I want this? Is it worth the stress? Can I get through this one, setback, and then just, all right, I'm ready. Let's go. We're on to the next. And then like cutting yourself slack is so key, especially if you're a parent who's building a business. There's a lot of opinions around how much time you should spend on your business, how much time you should spend with your kids. And then of course your internal struggle around all that stuff too. And it's like, there's no right answer. And some weeks you're going to be maybe, not the most present parent because you're dealing with something big at work. And then the next week you might not be as present for your employees because you're dealing with, kid stuff and family stuff. And so it's just understanding that like there's no right way and that you need to cut yourself slack and you're doing the best that you can.
Amazing. Jaime, this is so helpful. And I think that's such an important reminder for founders that are just gutting it out and working so hard on and encountering challenges every day. How can founders actually find you with Color Capital
Yep.
or anything else that you're doing in
Yeah,
order
I'm mostly active on Instagram these days. So definitely check me out there. It's Jaime Schmidt. It's JaimieSchmidt. And I'm happy to answer DMs, so don't hold back. LinkedIn I'm on occasionally as well, and that's it. And then my website is color.capital if you want to learn more about the fund.
Awesome. And she was just very generous in on our social. We shared a little bit more of her insights. When I go and read that, it was very helpful for a lot of people. So thank you. Final reminder, 10th house, our CPG cohort is closing on January 30th. You just have to go and apply. There are year-long memberships and there's lots of benefits inside that you can check out there. But thank you all so much for your time, for your amazing questions. And Jaime, again, we're so grateful for all your wisdom.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.